From the earliest moments of memory, the world around Clara seemed distant, as if she was merely a ghost drifting unnoticed through its corners. Other children played in the schoolyard, their laughter ringing out like a melody she was never part of. They ran, skipped, and tumbled with joy, while Clara sat under the shade of an old oak tree, her small figure half hidden by its towering branches. She watched them every day from a distance, clutching her worn-out doll to her chest. The children never asked her to join, nor did they seem to notice her at all. It wasn't that she didn't want to play. Her heart ached with the desire to run alongside them, to feel the warmth of friendship, to hear her name called out in that joyous tone. But Clara had learned early on that no one would ever call her name. It was easier to remain quiet, invisible, than to face the rejection that always followed. At home, the silence was even louder. Her parents were there, but they were lost in their own world. Her mother, distracted and cold, and her father, absent more often than not, always working or locked away in his study. She learned not to ask for their attention. The few times she tried, her small voice trembling with hope, were met with sighs of frustration or distant glances that told her she wasn't worth the time. Her room became her sanctuary, though it was far from comforting. It was sparsely furnished with only a small bed, a chair by the window, and the doll, her constant silent companion. Through that window, she would watch the world pass by, her heart heavy with the knowledge that it was a world she was not part of. She'd see children walk by, hand in hand with parents who smiled and bent down to listen to their every word. She longed for those gestures, those simple acts of love, but they never came. The years slipped by as they always do, in a blur of lonely days and quiet nights. Clara grew taller, her face thinning out, but the sadness in her eyes remained the same. Her classmates moved on, forming bonds, attending birthday parties, making memories, but Clara remained on the outside, always observing, never participating. She became a master at pretending it didn't hurt, her face a mask of indifference. Inside, though, the ache never left. It was a deep, gnawing emptiness that only seemed to grow with each passing year. As a teenager, Clara spent more time alone than ever before. Her school days were filled with quiet lunches in the library, her fingers tracing the worn spines of books she would never read, her mind drifting far away. She walked through the halls like a shadow, unnoticed and unremarkable. She watched the other students, their friendships, their romances, their laughter, and tried to imagine what it must feel like to be part of something, to be loved, to be needed. Her parents continued to ignore her, wrapped up in their own lives. She had stopped trying to reach out to them long ago. There was no point. The walls of her home felt like a cage, suffocating in their indifference. The only peace Clara found was in solitude, but even that was a double-edged sword. It was the only place she felt safe, but it was also a reminder of how utterly alone she was. As she grew older, Clara's isolation became her identity. She no longer wished for friends or love. She had long since accepted that such things were not meant for her. Instead, she sought solace in the quiet, in the predictable routines of her lonely life. She would walk through the park, her footsteps soft and measured, watching families and children from a distance. She no longer felt the sharp sting of longing, just a dull, persistent ache, like a bruise that never healed. Years passed. Clara grew into adulthood, moving out of her parents' house and into a small apartment on the edge of town. It was a quiet place, just like her childhood home, but this time, the solitude was her choice. She had learned to live with the silence. It was the only constant in her life. Her days were simple. She worked a mundane job in an office where no one knew her name. She spent her evenings reading or staring out the window at the world that still moved on without her. The ache of loneliness was no longer sharp. It had become a part of her, woven into the fabric of her being. She no longer cried herself to sleep, as she had done so many nights as a child. Now she simply closed her eyes and accepted the emptiness. As the years blurred into one another, Clara's existence remained the same. She aged, though she hardly noticed. Her once young face grew lined, her hair streaked with gray, but the world around her remained distant. She had no family, no friends, no one to mark the passing of time with her. She was, as she had always been, forgotten. One cold gray afternoon, as Clara sat by the window in her small apartment, she watched a group of children playing in the park below. They ran and laughed, their voices carrying up to her window in soft echoes. For a moment, she allowed herself to remember that little girl she had once been, clutching her doll as she watched other children play from the sidelines. She remembered the longing, the desperate hope that one day someone would notice her, would invite her into their world. But that day had never come. It never would. A single tear slipped down Clara's cheek as she turned away from the window. She no longer felt the sharp pain of loneliness. It had long since dulled into something she could live with. But sometimes in quiet moments like this, the weight of her forgotten existence was too much to bear. Clara sat in her chair, the years heavy on her shoulders, and closed her eyes. She had lived her entire life as an outsider, never loved, never needed, never seen. And now, as she sat alone in her silent apartment, she wondered if anyone would even notice when she was gone. The world outside continued to move, as it always had, and Clara remained a forgotten child who had grown into a forgotten woman, lost in the shadows of a life that had never truly begun.